In the heart of West Africa lies a country whose independence set the stage for the liberation of a continent. This is the story of Kwame Nkrumah, the visionary who led Ghana to become the first sub-Saharan African nation to break free from colonial rule. Born in a small village on the Gold Coast, Kwame Nkrumah's early life offered few signs that he would one day shape the destiny of a nation. But a spark was ignited within him, driving his pursuit of education and fueling a lifelong passion for freedom, not just for Ghana, but for all of Africa. As Europe carved up Africa, exploiting its resources and its people, Nkrumah's vision became clear. He would not only lead his people to independence, but work toward the total liberation and unity of Africa. His journey was filled with obstacles, triumphs, and challenges, but in the end, his impact would echo across generations. Join us as we delve into the life of Kwame Nkrumah, a life of resilience, radical change, and an unshakable belief in African self-determination. From his early days as a student in America to his rise as a leader of a newly independent Ghana, this is the story of a man who dared to dream of a free Africa. Nkrumah was born into the Nzima ethnic group who resided in the southwestern part of the Gold Coast, and his parents were Elizabeth Nyaniba of the Anona clan and Kofi Nonloma of the Asona clan. The village where he was born is Nkroful. This area is located between the river Ankraba on the east and the river Yano and its lagoons on the west. It is difficult to pinpoint the exact date and year of Nkrumah's birth, because during this period, no records were kept of birth dates in the outlying areas in the Nzima region. However, according to Nkrumah's priest in the Roman Catholic Church, his date of birth was September 21st, 1909. This was a guess on the part of the priest who baptized Nkrumah into the Catholic religion. As a young boy, Nkrumah showed an insatiable thirst for knowledge. His teachers at the local Catholic school recognized his potential, and he was encouraged to pursue further education. With the support of his family and local community, Nkrumah left his village to attend the prestigious Achimota School in Accra. At Achimota, Nkrumah excelled in his studies and developed a keen interest in philosophy and politics. But it was the injustices of colonial rule that stirred something deeper within him. Inspired by African history and the global fight for freedom, Nkrumah knew he needed to further his education and his quest for liberation abroad. After completing his studies at Achimota in 1930, Nkrumah found it extremely difficult to save the necessary funds for passage to the United States. Nkrumah was offered a teaching position at the Roman Catholic Junior School at Elmina, where he taught lower class 1. While teaching at the junior school, he helped form the Teachers Association at the school. This association was set up to improve their status at the school and to provide a mechanism for the voicing of grievances that the teachers had with the school administration. Nkrumah, during this period, was heavily influenced by the African nationalist newspaper, the African Morning Post. Many of the articles written by the Nigerian Nnamdi Azikiwe from Onitsha had tremendous impact on his consciousness. Azikiwe was a graduate of Howard University in the United States, and while he was there, he was heavily influenced by the Africanist historian William Leo Hansberry. Nkrumah felt that he needed to pursue higher education, and therefore, in 1935, went to Lagos to borrow money from an uncle living there in order to buy a ticket to travel to the United States. In 1935, Nkrumah boarded a ship bound for the United States. He arrived in the United States in October of 1935. His destination was Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. It was there, at Lincoln University, that he would sharpen his intellect and political views. He immersed himself in the study of sociology, theology, and political science while absorbing the racial struggles faced by African Americans in the segregated United States. The African population of America had suffered the most from the economic depression of the 1930s. Millions of Africans who lived in the southern U.S. were surviving under some of the most wretched conditions imaginable. During World War I in the 1920s, hundreds of thousands of Africans had left the rural South and moved into the urban areas of the northern industrial cities, seeking work and alleviation from the vicious racist Jim Crow system of Southern segregation. However, after coming north, the Africans found that the conditions in the North were just as bad, if not worse, than the conditions of the South. To take you back, during the 1920s, the African community in America had experienced a flowering of literacy, musical, and artistic expression. The main center of this cultural renaissance was in Harlem, which had become a center of African life by the end of World War I. This cultural renaissance was accompanied by the rise of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, headed by Marcus Garvey. Garvey's slogan, "Africa for the Africans, those at home and abroad," generated tremendous support among the African masses in America. The headquarters and main base of operations for the UNIA was in Harlem during the 1920s. In 1920, the organization held the Conference of Negro Peoples of the World, where thousands of representatives came from all over America, the Caribbean, and the African continent to participate. However, by the end of the 1920s, Garvey had been deported, the UNIA was harassed and crippled by the U.S. government, and the economic depression had effectively ended the cultural renaissance that was taking place in Harlem. The 1930s were marked by increased racial tension and overt forms of violence against Africans, such as lynchings and frame-ups in the courts, as demonstrated in the Scottsboro Boys case in Alabama. When Nkrumah arrived in the United States in 1935, he immediately began to pursue a college degree at Lincoln University. He was almost penniless when he arrived at Lincoln and talked with the university's president and made arrangements to take the entrance examination, which he passed, and was therefore awarded a part-time job at the school and a scholarship. Lincoln University was established in 1854. It was the first university in America that was designed to give higher education to people of African descent. Nkrumah graduated from Lincoln with a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and Sociology in 1939. During that year, he was voted the most interesting senior by his classmates at Lincoln. Later, in 1942, after spending 3 years as an assistant lecturer in philosophy at Lincoln and as a student, he was granted a Bachelor of Arts degree in theology. In the same year, 1942, Nkrumah also received a master's degree in education from the University of Pennsylvania. The next year, 1943, in February, he received the Master of Arts degree in philosophy from the University of Pennsylvania, where he studied under Professor Edgar Singer, Jr. After receiving a MA in philosophy, Nkrumah began to work on a doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania, where he took courses during 1943 to 1944, preparing to write a thesis in philosophy. However, it was during this period that Nkrumah fell ill as a result of overexhaustion. Nkrumah was consistently hard-pressed economically while he was in the United States. He lived among the masses of African people born in America, and therefore, as a result of his own personal experience, understood the nature and dimension of their struggle. He was determined to link the two situations in common efforts toward the alleviation of suffering on the part of Africans worldwide. These factors stirred Nkrumah's interest in the conditions of African people in America. While he was an instructor at Lincoln University, he frequently taught classes and presented lectures on the history of African people born in America. He investigated the various trends of political and sociological thought centered around the so-called Negro question. Nkrumah became involved in political activities in the United States while he was at the University of Pennsylvania. He assisted in the establishment of the African Studies section at the school. In addition, he also began to organize for the African Students Association, ASA, of America and Canada, where he was eventually elected president and remained active up until the time period when he left the United States. He became active in participating and studying the organizational techniques and political views among the various social trends in America. For example, he studied the Democrats, Republicans, Communists, and Trotskyites, where he met for the first time C.L.R. James. After reading Marx, Lenin, Hegel, and Mazzini, Nkrumah concluded that there was much within the philosophy of Marx, Engels, and Lenin that could be utilized for the liberation of the colonial territories. However, he stated that the book that fascinated him the most was the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey, which was published in 1923. Inspired by the works of Marcus Garvey and Webb Du Bois, Nkrumah's vision of a liberated Africa began to take shape. He believed in Pan-Africanism, a united continent free from colonial rule. His political consciousness deepened, and he became an outspoken advocate for African freedom, connecting with activists from across the diaspora. With a degree in hand and a fire in his heart, Nkrumah traveled to the United Kingdom in 1945. It was there, in the heart of London, that Nkrumah's ideas would collide with the growing winds of change sweeping across Africa. The Pan-African Congress, held in Manchester, would become a pivotal moment in his journey as he joined forces with other future African leaders determined to overthrow colonialism. In 1947, Kwame Nkrumah returned to the Gold Coast, now a man with a mission. He had been invited to serve as the General Secretary of the United Gold Coast Convention, UGCC, a political organization pushing for self-governance. But it wasn't long before Nkrumah realized that the UGCC's methods were too cautious, too gradual. Nkrumah believed that the time for independence was now. His approach was radical, calling for immediate self-rule through mass mobilization. With the support of students, workers, and the common people, Nkrumah launched the Convention People's Party, CPP, in 1949, vowing to fight for self-government now. The CPP quickly grew into a powerful force, but Nkrumah's activism came at a price. In 1950, he was arrested by the British colonial government and sentenced to prison for inciting civil disobedience. Yet, even behind bars, his influence only grew. In the 1951 elections, his party won a sweeping victory, and Nkrumah, still imprisoned, was elected to lead the government. His release from prison was greeted with nationwide celebration. The message was clear. The people stood with Nkrumah. In 1952, he became the first African Prime Minister of the Gold Coast. His leadership and vision would guide the country through the final years of colonial rule. Nkrumah's leadership extended beyond mere politics. He began laying the foundations for a post-colonial state, introducing reforms in education, health, and infrastructure. His economic policies aimed to industrialize the country, but his main focus was always clear: total independence. And on March 6, 1957, Nkrumah's dream came true. Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African nation to gain independence from colonial rule. Standing before a jubilant crowd, Nkrumah declared, "The independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of Africa." His words would resonate far beyond Ghana's borders, inspiring a wave of decolonization across Africa. March 6, 1957. will forever be remembered as the day Ghana became the first African nation south of the Sahara to achieve independence. After decades of struggle and sacrifice, the Gold Coast was reborn as the Republic of Ghana. On that historic day, Kwame Nkrumah stood before a jubilant nation and the world. His words, both triumphant and prophetic, echoed far beyond the borders of Ghana. We are going to demonstrate to the world, to the other nations, that we are prepared to lay our foundation, our own African identity. But for Nkrumah, this moment was only the beginning. He believed that Ghana's independence was tied to the liberation of the entire African continent. His vision extended far beyond the borders of his own country. He sought to unite a fractured continent, to free all of Africa from colonial domination. With the achievement of Ghana's independence, Nkrumah became the face of African liberation. He dedicated his efforts to building alliances with other nationalist leaders, hosting conferences, and speaking out against colonialism in all its forms. His tireless work laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the Organization of African Unity. Under Nkrumah's leadership, Ghana became a symbol of hope for the rest of Africa. His message was clear: Africa must unite. But his ambitions for a united continent were met with significant challenges, both from within Africa and from powerful external forces determined to maintain their influence over African nations. Throughout the 1960s, a wave of independence swept across Africa, with countries like Algeria, Kenya, and Nigeria gaining their freedom. But while Nkrumah celebrated these victories, he knew that true African unity required more than political independence. It demanded economic and social transformation rooted in a vision of collective progress. His vision extended far beyond the borders of Ghana. From the earliest days of his political career, he believed that the future of Africa depended on unity, a collective strength that could only be realized through Pan-Africanism. For Nkrumah, independence was not just about freeing individual nations. It was about liberating an entire continent from the grip of colonialism and forging a united African identity. Even before Ghana gained its independence, Nkrumah had established himself as a prominent figure in the Pan-African movement. In 1945, at the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester, England, Nkrumah joined forces with other African and Caribbean leaders to strategize the end of colonial rule. The Congress marked a significant moment in Nkrumah's political development, as he emerged as a leader determined not only to free Ghana, but also to inspire a continent-wide movement for liberation. Nkrumah's Pan-African vision called for the political and economic integration of the entire African continent. He believed that African nations, fragmented by colonial borders, would remain weak and vulnerable to external exploitation if they did not unite. In his mind, a United States of Africa was the only path to true freedom, prosperity, and self-reliance. In 1963, Nkrumah's dream took a significant step forward with the formation of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. The OAU brought together African leaders from across the continent to discuss collective security, economic cooperation, and the complete decolonization of Africa. While the OAU was a monumental achievement, it fell short of Nkrumah's ultimate goal, a fully integrated African political federation. Although Nkrumah's vision for a united Africa was shared by many, his calls for immediate political federation were met with resistance. Some African leaders, like Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, advocated for a more cautious step-by-step approach to unity, fearing that a hasty federation might jeopardize the fragile sovereignty of newly independent states. This difference in opinion created tensions within the Pan-African movement, as Nkrumah pushed for a centralized African government, while others prioritized national stability. Despite these disagreements, Nkrumah remained unwavering in his pursuit of Pan-Africanism. He dedicated Ghana's resources to supporting liberation movements across the continent. From Algeria's fight for independence to South Africa's struggle against apartheid, Nkrumah believed that Ghana had a responsibility to support oppressed African peoples wherever they were. This commitment to African unity and freedom made Nkrumah a beacon of hope for liberation movements across the continent. However, Nkrumah's Pan-African ambitions were not without controversy. His intervention in the Congo crisis following the assassination of Patrice Lumumba was seen by some as an overreach. Nkrumah sent Ghanaian troops as part of a UN peacekeeping mission, hoping to prevent the Congo from falling under the control of neo-colonial forces. While Nkrumah's intentions were rooted in his belief in African solidarity, the move deepened internal divisions within Ghana and among African leaders, some of whom saw his actions as an imposition. Nkrumah also used his writings to spread his Pan-African message. In his book, Africa Must Unite, he outlined his vision for a continental government with a single army, economic system, and foreign policy. In Neo-Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, Nkrumah warned of the dangers of foreign powers maintaining control over African resources and economies, even after independence. These works cemented his legacy as a leading intellectual force behind the Pan-African movement. Although Nkrumah's vision of a fully united Africa did not materialize in his lifetime, his ideas have left an indelible mark on the continent. The African Union, founded in 2002 as a successor to the OAU, is rooted in the principles Nkrumah championed: African unity, collective security, and economic cooperation. Today, Nkrumah's dream of a united Africa continues to inspire leaders, intellectuals, and activists across the continent. Kwame Nkrumah's Pan-African ambitions were ahead of their time. While the dream of a United States of Africa remains elusive, the spirit of his vision lives on. His legacy is a reminder that Africa's strength lies in its unity, and his call for a continent free from external control continues to resonate with new generations of Africans striving for a better future. With independence secured, Kwame Nkrumah's next challenge was to build a new nation from the ground up. His vision for Ghana's development was rooted in socialist ideals, an economy that would serve the people, not the interests of foreign powers. He set out to transform Ghana into an industrialized, self-reliant state, leading by example in the fight against underdevelopment across Africa. He also prioritized education, seeing it as the key to Ghana's future. Under his leadership, schools and universities were built across the country, and a national literacy campaign was launched. Nkrumah believed that education would not only provide skills, but also instill a sense of national pride and purpose in the next generation of Ghanaians. Social welfare programs were another cornerstone of Nkrumah's policies. He introduced free healthcare, expanded access to clean water, and built public housing for the growing urban population. His goal was to create a modern, egalitarian society, one that could serve as a model for the rest of Africa. However, Nkrumah's economic vision was not without its critics. His government took control of key industries, nationalizing foreign-owned companies in an attempt to reduce Ghana's dependence on the West. While this earned him admiration from some, others argued that the rapid expansion of state control stifled innovation and burdened the economy. As the 1960s progressed, economic challenges began to mount. Falling commodity prices, especially cocoa, Ghana's main export, strained the country's finances. Nkrumah's ambitious projects, many funded through foreign loans, added to the pressure. By the mid-1960s, Ghana was facing severe financial difficulties, and dissatisfaction with Nkrumah's government was growing. As Kwame Nkrumah guided Ghana into its new era of independence, he began a new chapter in his personal life as well. In 1958, he married Fathia Risk, a teacher from Egypt. Their marriage, a union between a Ghanaian leader and an Egyptian woman, symbolized Nkrumah's dedication to Pan-African unity as it bridged the cultural divide between North and West Africa. Fathia was chosen for Nkrumah by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, a close ally in the Pan-African and anti-imperialist movements. Fathia Risk Nkrumah became a supportive partner, often appearing alongside him at public events, embodying the Pan-African values he championed. Together, they had 3 children, Gorke, later known as Gamal, Samia, and Sekou. Nkrumah's family brought a semblance of normalcy to his life amid the intense demands of leadership, and he remained devoted to them despite the political challenges he faced. Kwame Nkrumah's foreign policy was shaped by the global realities of the Cold War. As Ghana navigated its new position as an independent nation, Nkrumah aimed to keep his country aligned with neither the West nor the East. Instead, he sought a path of non-alignment, balancing relationships with both the United States and the Soviet Union, while pushing for the greater cause of African unity. Following a course of international neutrality and political cautiousness, he sought economic and technical aid from the U.S. and the Soviet Union. He visited New York to address the United Nations General Assembly. While there, he renewed old acquaintances and was welcomed by an enthusiastic audience that included Minister Malcolm X, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, and Chuck Stone of the American Committee on Africa. At the UN, Nkrumah was very explicit in his remarks concerning the colonizers and the wretched conditions they created and left in Africa. He said in part, "The flowing tide of African nationalism sweeps everything before it and constitutes a challenge to the colonial powers to make a just restitution for the years of injustice and crimes committed against our continent." For years, Africa has been the footstool of colonialism and imperialism, exploitation and degradation. But Africa does not seek vengeance. Africa wants her freedom. It is a simple call, but it is also a signal lighting a red warning to those who would tend to ignore it. He met with President John F. Kennedy. The visit symbolized Nkrumah's efforts to secure aid and support for Ghana's development. Kennedy, seeing Ghana as a key ally in the region, pledged financial assistance and technical expertise for Ghana's infrastructure projects. Despite their differing ideologies, both leaders shared an interest in seeing Ghana prosper. At the same time, Nkrumah fostered strong ties with the Soviet Union. The Soviets admired his socialist economic policies and anti-imperialist stance, providing support for industrial projects like the Akosombo Dam. Nkrumah's ability to navigate between these two superpowers allowed Ghana to benefit from both sides during the early years of his rule. In 1963, Nkrumah was awarded the Lenin Peace Prize by the Soviet Union. The Gold Coast had been among the wealthiest and most socially advanced areas in Africa, with schools, railways, hospitals, social security, and an advanced economy. Under Nkrumah's leadership, Ghana adopted some socialist policies and practices. Nkrumah was a founding member of the Non-Aligned Movement, an international organization of states that sought to avoid alignment with the major power blocs of the Cold War. Alongside leaders like Josip Broz Tito of Yugoslavia, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, and Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Nkrumah championed the principle of self-determination for newly independent nations. In international forums, Nkrumah used his platform to advocate for decolonization and global peace. He frequently spoke out against neocolonialism, the continued economic and political dominance of former colonial powers over their former colonies. His vision for Africa's future was not just about political independence, but about true sovereignty, freedom from foreign interference. One of Nkrumah's most controversial foreign policy decisions was Ghana's involvement in the Congo crisis. Following the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, Nkrumah sent Ghanaian troops as part of the United Nations peacekeeping mission, hoping to prevent the Congo from falling into civil war. However, this intervention deepened tensions within Ghana and with other African nations. Kwame Nkrumah, celebrated as a liberator and visionary, was not without his critics. His time in power saw unprecedented growth and development in Ghana, but it also became mired in controversy. As his vision for a strong, independent nation took shape, the methods he employed and the decisions he made sparked debates that persist to this day. At the heart of many of these controversies was Nkrumah's growing centralization of power. As Ghana's first prime minister and later its president, he believed that a strong central authority was essential to steer the country through its formative years. But this drive for control would lead to accusations of authoritarianism, suppression of dissent, and an erosion of democracy. In 1960, Nkrumah became the president of the newly declared Republic of Ghana, following a national referendum that also granted him sweeping powers. His government passed the Preventive Detention Act, which allowed for the detention of individuals without trial for up to 5 years. Nkrumah argued that these measures were necessary to protect the young nation from subversion and foreign interference. However, many viewed it as a tool to silence political opponents. Leaders of opposition parties, intellectuals, and even former allies of Nkrumah found themselves behind bars. Among them was J.B. Dankwa, a key figure in the fight for independence and an outspoken critic of Nkrumah's policies. His death in prison in 1965, under suspicious circumstances, became a flashpoint for those who believed that Nkrumah was turning Ghana into a dictatorship. As Nkrumah's grip on power tightened, his government exerted more control over the media and the press. Journalists who criticized his policies faced censorship or imprisonment. The independence that had once galvanized the nation began to feel stifled under the weight of Nkrumah's authoritarian rule. His domestic policies also came under fire. Nkrumah's vision of rapid industrialization and state-led economic development was ambitious, but it strained Ghana's economy. His government nationalized foreign businesses and pushed for large-scale infrastructure projects like the Akosombo Dam. While these initiatives were meant to boost Ghana's self-reliance, they came at a high cost. By the mid-1960s, Ghana was facing severe economic challenges. The world price of cocoa, Ghana's primary export, had fallen sharply, leading to a decline in government revenue. At the same time, the country's external debt ballooned as Nkrumah's administration took out foreign loans to finance its projects. The promise of prosperity was fading, and everyday Ghanaians began to feel the pinch of shortages and inflation. Nkrumah's critics argued that his economic policies were overly ambitious and poorly planned. They pointed to the many factories built under his regime that sat idle due to mismanagement or a lack of resources. Meanwhile, the ordinary people who had supported Nkrumah's rise to power were now bearing the brunt of the economic downturn. Another source of controversy was the cult of personality that Nkrumah cultivated. His image was ubiquitous on stamps, currency, and public buildings. Schools were renamed in his honor, and students were taught to see him as the Osagyefo, or Redeemer. To many, it seemed that Nkrumah was elevating himself to the status of a near-mythical figure, detached from the struggles of ordinary Ghanaians. Cracks continued to appear in Kwame Nkrumah's leadership. While his vision for a socialist, industrialized Ghana was bold, the realities on the ground were becoming more difficult to manage. Economic hardships, compounded by global commodity price drops, particularly in cocoa, strained the country's finances. Discontent began to grow among Ghanaians. Nkrumah's increasingly authoritarian methods, suppressing opposition, controlling the press, and imprisoning critics, alienated many of his early supporters. Strikes and protests became more frequent, and while Nkrumah called for unity, his grip on power was slipping. At the same time, Nkrumah feared external forces were conspiring against him. He believed that foreign governments, particularly the CIA, were working to undermine his presidency due to his socialist policies and Pan-African ideals. Though later evidence would suggest that foreign interference did play a role, the growing unrest within Ghana was undeniable. In February 1966, as Nkrumah embarked on a diplomatic mission to mediate in the Vietnam conflict, a group of Ghanaian military officers, backed by elements of the police, seized the opportunity to overthrow him. The coup was swift and largely bloodless, with the coup leaders announcing that Nkrumah's government had mismanaged the country and needed to be replaced. Nkrumah was in China when the news reached him. His government had fallen. Devastated, he found himself in exile, unable to return to the country he had fought so hard to lead to independence. President Sékou Touré of Guinea declared Nkrumah the co-president of his country, offering him refuge for the rest of his life. From Guinea, Nkrumah continued to write and advocate for African unity, but his influence had waned. The man who had once been at the forefront of African liberation was now removed from the movement he had helped to inspire. Although Kwame Nkrumah's political career ended in exile, his legacy has only grown over the decades. Today, he is remembered as a visionary whose ideas about African unity, self-reliance, and freedom from colonialism continue to resonate with African leaders and people alike. His writings on Pan-Africanism, neocolonialism, and the future of Africa remain some of the most influential works in African political thought. Leaders like Nelson Mandela, Julius Nyerere, and Thomas Sankara were inspired by Nkrumah's vision, carrying forward the dream of a united Africa. Across Africa, his image is immortalized in monuments, and his name lives on in universities, streets, and public institutions. His bold ideas about African socialism, his leadership in the fight against colonialism, and his unshakable belief in the potential of Africa remain an enduring part of the continent's story. For the people of Ghana, Nkrumah is more than just a historical figure. He is a symbol of hope, resilience, and the belief that Africa can rise. His leadership inspired generations, and his message of African pride and self-determination continues to inspire new movements for change today. Though his dream of a fully united Africa has not yet been realized, the spirit of his vision lives on. The African Union, formed in 2002, traces its roots to the Organization of African Unity that Nkrumah helped establish. And today, as African nations continue to navigate global challenges, the words of Kwame Nkrumah remind us, we face neither east nor west, we face forward. Kwame Nkrumah's story is a testament to the power of dreams, the importance of unity, and the cost of leadership. His life was filled with triumphs and tragedies, successes and setbacks, but through it all, he remained steadfast in his belief in Africa's potential. Today, as Africa continues to rise, the lessons of Nkrumah's leadership are as relevant as ever. His ideas on economic self-reliance, political independence, and Pan-African unity offer a blueprint for the continent's future. But his story is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of authoritarianism, the complexities of building a nation, and the enduring challenge of balancing ideals with the realities of governance. Nkrumah's legacy, both revered and controversial, will forever be shaped by the complexities of his leadership. To some, he remains a hero, the father of Ghanaian independence and a champion of African unity. To others, his rule serves as a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked power and the thin line between visionary leadership and authoritarianism. In the end, Kwame Nkrumah's story is one of immense ambition and profound contradictions. His dream for a united, self-reliant Africa continues to inspire, but his failures remind us that even the greatest of leaders can be undone by the burdens of power. As we look to the future, we are reminded of the sacrifices made by Nkrumah and his generation of freedom fighters. The torch of African independence has been passed to a new generation, and the question remains, will Africa finally unite as Nkrumah envisioned? Kwame Nkrumah's legacy is more than just his achievements in Ghana. It is the belief in the promise of Africa, a continent united, strong, and free. His words continue to inspire, "We must unite now or perish." Kwame Nkrumah's legacy is more than just his achievements in Ghana. It is the belief in the promise of Africa, a continent united, strong, and free. His words continue to inspire, "We must unite now or perish." As we look to the future, we are reminded of the sacrifices made by Nkrumah and his generation of freedom fighters. The torch of African independence has been passed to a new generation, and the question remains, will Africa finally unite as Nkrumah envisioned? Let us know your thoughts on the legacy of Kwame Nkrumah and his policies. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey through history and want to learn more about influential figures shaping our world, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching.